My topic for our student presentation is HTML entities. Generally speaking, HTML entities are fairly simple to understand as well as use. In fact, we've already used several of them in our first few projects. So let's begin by answering this question. What are HTML entities? Well, according to Mozilla, an HTML entity is a piece of text that begins with an ampersand and ends with a semicolon. They're a type of code used to represent certain types of characters within the content of your document. So what kind of characters do they represent and why do we need them? HTML entities are frequently used to display reserved characters, which would otherwise be interpreted as HTML code, invisible characters like non-breaking spaces, characters that are difficult to type with a standard keyboard, and many types of shapes and symbols. So what are reserved characters? Well, they are specific typographic characters which we use in HTML to mark up the text. If you use these characters within your text, your browser will parse them as HTML code. This is one of the most important reasons why we need to use HTML entities within our text. This is a chart of the 5 reserved characters in HTML, and as you can see, we have a quotation mark, apostrophe, ampersand, less than, and greater than. It also shows the 2 types of code that can be used to include HTML entities within your content. You can use either the entity name or the number code as shown here. The advantages of using entity names is that they're pretty easy to remember. The disadvantage of using them is that browsers may not support all entity names, but browsers support for the number code is very good. If you use the less than and greater than characters within your text, your browser is going to try to interpret them as an HTML tag. For example, we might need to include some HTML tags within our text like this. This is a paragraph tag, and it's trying to teach someone how to properly set up a p tag in HTML. So here we have the p and the p within the other p tags. And the problem is going to be that the browser will assume that the sample code within the paragraph tags is another HTML tag, which will cause problems with the display of your page, and it also won't validate properly. So what can be done about this problem? Well, this is where HTML entities can come in very handy. We can use them to replace the less than and greater than symbols in our text, and the code is really simple. For example, the less than and greater than symbols can be written like this, with an ampersand first, LT for less than, and then an ending semicolon. And then the greater than is the same format with an ampersand and GT for greater than, and then a semicolon. And so before we move on, I would like to show you what this sentence would look like if we put it into my basic page in brackets. So here we are in brackets, and as you can see, we have some red going on here, which indicates that there's some kind of an error. And in addition, we can see that our p tags, which we didn't really want to be included in our code, are being included because they've turned blue, which indicates that they are a tag rather than just text. And let's look at the live preview to see what happens there. And as we saw in the brackets editor, these are indeed being recognized as different lines of text and different paragraphs, and they're all being shown in different blocks, which is not what we want. We wanted this tag here, this section here, to show an opening p tag and a closing p tag, so that it can show a demonstration of how to properly include this into your page. This isn't solving our problem. So what will solve this problem? Well, HTML entities, of course. So let's check that out. But before we do, let's go to the validator and see what happens there. So here I've copied it into the validator for HTML, and we'll give it a check, see what's happening. And we'll scroll down and see. And indeed, we have an error on the P element. So if we go back up here, if we made some changes by including HTML entities around this P and this closing P tag, it should validate correctly. So I'm going to do that and then I'll come right back. So I went ahead and made the changes and we have our entities here. And if you'll notice, I did not put any extra space here because we do not put spaces between brackets and the P in our P tag. And also I left in the / because that is not a reserved character and it will display correctly without any entities. So let's check it again and see what happens. And we scroll down and yay, no errors or warnings to show. So that did solve our problem. And let's go back to brackets and the live preview and see what our updated code will do there. So I copied the code in here, and as you can see, these are no longer being looked at as tags, and the red has been removed from these tags. So it looks like everything is good. Let's check it out in the live preview to be sure. And now everything looks good. Our paragraph is being displayed in one block rather than 3. And the characters are being represented here in the P tag appropriately and the closing tag. So now our sentence makes sense and it is doing what we wanted it to do. So some of the basic entity names are fairly easy to memorize, but the numbers, of course, will be much more difficult to remember. So it's a good idea to keep a chart with all of the HTML entities handy. This is the best chart that I found in my research at devw3.org. And it shows, I believe, over 1,400 different characters in there. There's way too many characters, of course, to memorize. So it's wonderful to have this resource available, and I'll show you what it looks like here. So here's what it looks like. You have your accents, symbols, shapes, etc. everywhere throughout this document, and it shows you all the code. Like here's a copyright and copy, and it shows you can also use capital here, but just so you know, these are case sensitive, so you need to use the proper case as well. And there we have an at and question mark and our less than, which we already learned about. So these can be very useful to you in your content. So I hope you can use this resource and take advantage of it. HTML entities can represent invisible characters such as EM or EN spaces or M or N spaces, or non-breaking spaces. A non-breaking space is a space that will not break into a new line, which I found at W3 Schools. There are many invisible characters, including one called thin space. This is one that I've used, and here's how you write it: ampersand with thin SP and our semicolon. This creates a thin space between characters, which can be handy in some cases. I'll show you how I used it. So this is my index HTML page, which is the portal page. And in my footer, I found that I wanted to have more space between the different elements within the footer, like my name and the copyright and other things. So I did some research and found the thin space to be the answer to what I needed, to add just a little extra space between things. And I also included a mid dot, which is another HTML entity. It is a little dot that shows halfway up on a vertical space. It looks like a period, but it's placed differently. So I included that, and over here I've removed the thin space, which I previously had, so that I can show you what the difference would look like. So I'll show you that in the preview. So here you see, this is where I removed it, and there's our mid dot. And I felt that the spacing was a little too crowded. So over here, I included the thin space, and it added a very nice amount of space between these different elements. And so it gave them some breathing room. And I like this effect, so I chose to use it. But of course, this is all personal preference. And this is just one example that you can use in your own work if you like. So some characters can be difficult to type on a standard keyboard. And this can be especially true of the various types of accent marks that are commonly used in many European languages. So if you recall, Guilherme from our basic HTML videos, he speaks a different language, and so this is something that he uses frequently in his content. And here is a little section of the resource chart that I showed you earlier, and showing some of the different accent marks that can be used. So entities are a really good option for using with accent marks because they will ensure that these will be displayed appropriately and as intended, and regardless of any problems that you might have with the encoding. So it's another solution that can be used. HTML entities can also be used to include shapes and symbols within the text of your page. Some of the shapes that they have include stars, hearts, diamonds, and even a phone. And some of the symbols include, of course, a copyright, which we've used, musical notes, and money symbols like the dollar. Here in our example, this was from our basic page, which if some of you may have used the star entity, which is what I used in my basic page, and here's an example of what it looks like. And it's very easy to use in your content, just ampersand, star, and a semicolon. And then the copyright symbol, which we also used already and is shown here in my portal page, is very simple to use as well, with an ampersand, copy, and semicolon. So in conclusion, you can see HTML entities serve some very useful purposes, such as when we need to display reserved characters, use invisible or non-breaking spaces, display accent marks, or display shapes and symbols within our text. These are the references that I used, and many of them were very useful, and they gave me a lot of information about what entities are and how they can be used, as well as some of the charts that allow you to find the codes easily. So the next time you need to use a symbol, reserved character, invisible space, or an accent mark in your website, don't forget about HTML entities. Thank you for listening, and I hope this was valuable to you.